Well, it looks like it's the Second Corinthians gig today. I keep shifting my roles in a docetic fashion. Yesterday, I took on the likeness of the First Corinthians geek, but now, almost simultaneously, I'm the Second Corinthians geek. Well, as my old pastor Don Mars used to say, I'm going to quote myself so as not to misrepresent my own views. Here's my intro to Second Corinthians. The so-called second epistle to the Corinthians seems rather to be a collection of materials that had fallen into disarray and then been ineptly reassembled by someone who wanted to circulate a second anti-heretical, anti-Cerinthian, right, treatise. Most scholars agree, at least, that it's a composite work. Where they differ is over which fragment properly goes with which other in the attempt to restore something like the original order. Of course, you remember, I'm sure, that pretty much the same thing is often thought to be true of the Gospel of John. Most scholars, however, believe all or most of the material in Second Corinthians to be authentically Pauline. I, however, belong to that majority of nutty Bible scholars, following Bruno Bauer, W.C. van Manen, and the Dutch radical critics, and thus I reject Pauline authorship for most or all of these materials. But, well, as usual, I'll try to consider it with one hand in the traditional Lucky Seven view of the epistles, and with the other, the more skeptical Dutch radical approach. That ought to pretty totally confuse you, and if it does, I've done my work for today. Okay, the majority of the Second Corinthians materials seem to have first made up a pair of letters composed in the interest of counteracting a Catholicizing trend to supplant local Pauline traditions for a number of churches, retroactively providing alternate non-heretical foundation legends, rewriting history to make someone other than Paul the founder of the various congregations. The whole polemic here, if advanced by the historical Paul, would be aimed at rivals who have poached among his converts, moving in to undermine his work after he's passed on, instead of striking out with pioneer evangelism efforts in new territories. But as Van Manen points out, the perspective here is retrospective. The labors of Paul are in the past, over and done. The writer looks back on them, delineating the bounds of the Pauline mission field, like the Deuteronomic historian mapping out the ancestral lots of the tribes of Israel. You get this one, you get that one. Okay, and if the letter is pseudonymous, the argument is instead aimed at posthumous attempts to supplant the legacy of Pauline congregations by proposing new foundation legends that Peter or John founded this or that Pauline congregation. In this way, the Orthodox eventually sought to replace the heretical credentials of the Alexandrian Church, founded by Carpocrates, possibly, with Orthodox credentials. Mark as the first bishop of Alexandria? Though Marcion and Basilides planted Christianity in Edessa, later apologists for Orthodoxy claimed Addai, or Thaddeus, one of the 70, had founded the church there. John has become the apostle of Ephesus to replace Paul, on whom the blame for Gnostic heresy, perhaps rightly, had been laid. In this case, the whole epistle will be seen as equivalent to Paul's fictive farewell speech in Acts 20:18 through 35, where the Acts author has retrojected into Paul's time the heretical situation in the author's own day, and Gnostics and Encratites swarming all over Asia Minor, where Paul had ministered, and claiming him as their predecessor. Well, can't have that. It's an attempt to forestall retroactively such attempts at supplanting the heretical Pauline legacy. I know that after my departure, wolves will come in and ravage your flocks and all that, in other words, and they'll blame me, but I had nothing to do with it. Yeah, that's right. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, there were various Paulinist Gnostics, Encratites, and so on, who weren't too popular among the gang at Rome. Now, this would seem to be the point even if Paul had nothing to do with the foundation of the churches in questions. I mean, they may have pulled the same trick, right? Claiming apostolic succession and credentials because, Paul was here, was he? After all, two can play this game. Perhaps such letters are clever attempts to make headway for Marcionite Christianity or Gnosticism in the churches being addressed, trying to supply a fictive, retroactive Pauline pedigree. Come back to Paul would mean join the latter-day Pauline movement. Yeah, that's a great case of what Derrida says calls the dangerous supplement. You are ostensibly adding something on, but in fact, what you're doing is supplanting the original, not adding to it. Okay, the first letter you can find starting in chapter 10, verses 1 through chapter 13, 9, first half of the verse, 9a. Then you can find another piece of it in chapter 2, 1 through 6:13, and chapter 7, verses 2 through 4, chapter 13, 9b through 14. I wonder if I have a typo here. Let me just check something. Okay, I think I got it right. All right, the first letter opens more abruptly than any other epistle attributed to Paul. It may be that a typical, more elaborate salutation stood here originally, but was cut off when the scribe decided to connect all the loose pages together. But then why would he not simply have made it the opening of a separate letter? Presumably the brusque "I, Paul" opening was thought fitting as the opening of what is called the severe letter, which caused so much grief that's discussed in chapter 7, verse 8. as if Paul is so upset and urgent that he feels he must skip the usual pleasantries and go straight for the jugular. At any rate, we ought to note that the manner of self-representation used in the opening, I so-and-so, always denotes pseudepigraphy. It protests authorial identity too much, makes too much of a big deal out of what would be taken for granted ordinarily. And here's some examples you can look up on your own. You find these I so-and-so things in seemingly, for other reasons, seemingly forged or pseudepigraphal books. How's about Daniel chapter 7, verse 15, and again in verse 28, chapter 8, verses 1, 15, and 27, chapter 9, verse 2, Daniel chapter 10, verse 2, followed by 7, then Daniel 12, 5, Revelation 1, 9, and 22, 8, and 16, Protevangelium of James 25, 1, Infancy Gospel of Thomas 1, 1, Apocalypse of Peter 2, Gospel of Peter 60, 4th Ezra 2, 33, and verse 42, then chapter 3, verse 1, Tobit 1, 3, Apocryphon of John 1:19, Book of Thomas the Contender, chapter 1, verse 2, First Enoch 25:1, Apocalypse of Zephaniah, bet you never knew that was in the pseudepigrapha, B, verse 7, Second Baruch 6:1, 8:3, 10:5, 11:1, 13:1, 35:1, 44:1, 77:1, Third Baruch 1, 3, and 7, chapter 4, verses. Third Baruch, chapter 1, verses 3, 7, and 4. Then, why can't I read today? Apocalypse of Zephaniah, B, apparently the two versions of that, chapter 7. Then Second Baruch, 6:1, 8:3, 10:5, 11:1, 13:1, 35:1, 44:1, 77:1, Third Baruch 1, 3, and 7, chapter 4, verse 1, chapter 5, verse 1, chapter 7, verse 1, chapter 9, verse 1, chapter 16, verse 5, Apocalypse of Abraham 1, 2, and 4, 6, 1, Testament of Levi 2, 1, Testament of Solomon 1, 3, and 5, 2, 1, 5, and 9, 5, chapter 5, verses 6 and 13, chapter 6, verse 9, and 10 and 12, then 7, chapter 7, verses 1 and 7, chapter 8, verse 5, and verse 12, chapter 9, verse 5, chapter 10, verse 10, chapter 12, verse 4, chapter 13, verses 3, 5, and 6, chapter 14, 8, chapter 15, 13, chapter 18, 41, chapter 19, 1, chapter 20, verse 5, and verse 18, chapter 22, verses 6 and 17, chapter 23, 4, and chapter 25, 8. Obviously, you're not going to have the opportunity to look all that stuff up unless you see it in writing, and even then you probably won't live long enough to look them all up. But the point is, look at the volume of this, how many of these citations there are, and there are more, where Ezra, and so on, that's always protesting too much. Okay, let no one think the text of the epistle is taken up solely with dreary church politics. On the contrary, the discussion of true and false apostleship, the genuine versus superficial following of Christ, it's all filled with some of the most profound spiritual insights to be found anywhere in the New Testament, seems to me. Had a course on this one epistle at Gordon Conwell Seminary with Gordon Fee. Really great. This guy had such a gift for pointing out the profundities in it. Okay, now I say all of that was in the first, the original letter used here. But what about the second letter? What part of the territory does that cover? Well, that would be chapter 1, verses 1 through 2. Chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, 13. Then chapter 5 through 16. So the second letter expresses gratitude and relief for the happy resolution of the conflict, much like the reunion scene between Jesus and Peter in John 21, 15 through 17. The two letters follow one another directly, and from the first circulated together in the manner of an epistolary novel, kind of like Dracula, a letter from Van Helsing, a letter from Lucy to John, and so on. Chapters 8 and 9 are really two more letters, according to L. Gordon Rylance. They seem to be a pair of independent fundraising letters, written probably by two different people, but both using Paul's name to encourage generosity, just like the gospel writers used Jesus as a mouthpiece for their own advice for readers to give their possessions to the poor, right? Whoever does not give up all that he has cannot be my disciple. Okay, chapter 8, verse 23 appears to introduce Titus in a fashion wholly unnecessary if the chapter actually formed part of the preceding text, since 9:1 appears to introduce the collection as a new, let me go back over that. Chapter 8, verse 23 appears to introduce Titus in a fashion wholly unnecessary if the chapter formed part of the preceding text, since Titus is there supposed to be well known to the Corinthians. Why introduce him twice? Chapter 9:1 appears to introduce the collection as a new topic, so it can't originally follow chapter 8, which was all about the collection. Both chapters envision a team arriving to collect the funds, while chapter 8, verse 18 through 19 and 22 speak of some famous brother, an evangelistic preacher who will oversee matters. Oddly, he isn't named, which may suggest that this was a blank to be filled in with the name of anybody who wanted to use the letter of introduction to garner the money. The chapter 9 letter appears to be earlier than the chapter 8 letter, but the ancient scribe just didn't really notice that. He was confused enough already. Most scholars recognize that the brief little section in chapter 6 from verse 14 to the first verse of chapter 7 has no connection to its context. It seems, in fact, to be a piece of a conservative Jewish synagogue sermon addressed to Jews tempted by assimilationism. Probably whoever pieced 2 Corinthians together found this material on the back of a scrap and just kept copying front to back and then on to the next sheet, not realizing this material was an older document and that someone short of paper had copied the Pauline material onto the empty back of it. He then made a minimal attempt to harmonize, as you can see from the redactional seam there once we get to it. So enough of my pedantic blusterings by way of introduction. Let's take a look at the actual text. So let's start with what scholars call the severe letter, where Paul is really lowering the boom. I, Paul, myself, beseech you by the meekness and the gentleness of Christ. I, who am so humble among you in person, but so fierce on paper, right? He's being sarcastic about his opponent's derision of him in Corinth. Verse 2, now I beg you, don't make it necessary for me to act in person with the boldness with which I plan to be daring towards some who consider us to be behaving by mere mortal standards. For though we live in the flesh, we wage war not in a worldly manner, with actual weapons. Verse 4, for the weapons of our warfare are not material, but derive from God their power to overthrow fortress mentalities, turning aside the rapier of argument and demolishing every Babel tower raised up against true knowledge of God, and taking prisoner every scheme to convert it forcibly to obey Christ, and standing ready to avenge all disobedience once your obedience is secured. This isn't all just your fault. There are others involved. Don't worry. I'm planning on getting to them too. Verse 7, you look no deeper than the surface of things. If anyone has satisfied himself that he belongs to Christ, then he had better take another look and see that if he belongs to Christ, so do we. It's like, if your faith as a Christian is genuine and you got it from me when I was there preaching, how can you imagine that his faith is counterfeit, as his opponents there, his detractors are suggesting, the guy's a fake, listen to us instead. Well, gee, that's odd. If I'm a fake, I guess you must be too, since you got your faith from me, right? Oh, hadn't thought of that. Verse 8, for even if I do brag more than you, wait a minute. Yeah, all right. Even if I do brag more than usual about our authority, which the Lord gave to fortify you, not to demolish you, I shall not wind up ashamed of what I said, for fear of frightening you through the epistles. His epistles, he says, are weighty and powerful. Who's the he? Well, whoever it is that's a would-be rival of Paul, trying to get the Corinthians to transfer their allegiance to him. His epistles, he says, are weighty and powerful, to be sure, but his presence in person is weak and his oratory contemptible. Verse 11, well, let such a person remember this. What we are in word, in epistles, while absent, we will also be in person and in action. You think I can't back up my rebukes and threats that I make in the letters, or I wouldn't have the nerve to say that in person? Well, just wait till I get there. You'll see for yourself. Verse 10, Oh, yeah, verse 11, sorry. Well, yeah, I just did that one. I'm sorry. 12. Oh, we would never presume to class ourselves or to compare ourselves with some who commend themselves, but they, measuring themselves only among themselves and comparing themselves only with themselves, naturally do not understand. It's very much like when John has Jesus say to the scribes and the Sanhedrinists, he's saying, your trouble is that you seek glory or approval or admiration, esteem from one another, and you don't give a damn about the approval of God on your little shows. Same sort of idea here, I think. 13. But on the other hand, we will not boast without any measure, but rather according to the yardstick which God calibrated and apportioned to us, demarcating our sphere of activity as far as you, and even reached you. Um, 14, for we do not overreach our proper bounds as if our territory did not reach as far as you, for we came all the way to you in our preaching of the gospel of Christ. So somebody's saying, Paul has no business here. Oh, yeah, I started the church, if I remember correctly. Okay. But expecting that as your faith matures, we will be more appreciated by you according to our assignment there until, because God has sent us there, right? Until finally you appreciate us fully. We aim to preach the gospel in the regions beyond you, not to brag of things already accomplished in someone else's domain. No. Quote, if anyone wants to brag, let him extol the greatness of the Lord, which is a quote from Jeremiah 9:24. Hmm. Ex- Okay, we aim to preach the gospel in the regions beyond you, not to brag of things already accomplished in someone else's domain. I mean, if we stopped only working your plot of evangelistic territory, what would be the point? We couldn't. We'd have nothing to brag about. It was your labors, not ours. If you founded that church. Verse 18, for it is not the one who commends himself that is approved, but the one whom the Lord commends. Oh, let's see. Yeah, we got some more time. Let's get into chapter 11. I ask you to permit me a little bit of foolishness. No, really, permit me. For I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy. Like God being a jealous God. He doesn't want to share his worshipers with these false deities. What the heck? Um, so, same thing here. For I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy. I betrothed you to one husband, planning to present a pure virgin to Christ. But now I fear that perhaps somehow, as the serpent seduced Eve by his deviousness, your minds may have been seduced from the simple purity of Christ. For indeed, if someone arrives and proclaims another Jesus whom we did not proclaim, what? Oh, another Jesus? Well, it's possible that there were other sects or cults or whatever that also had a savior named Jesus, which kind of means savior anyway. So it's not hard to imagine that there were different Jesuses, uh, and uh, and of course, then you got to ask, well, did these different Jesus figures, whether historical or legendary, eventually get merged as the shrinking movements decided they better merge with another one before they were completely eradicated. And so you had bits and pieces of different religions now in one, including the idea of a savior, Jesus, even though he may have been very different. Now, that would make a lot of sense if you think of the many hats Jesus wears in the Gospels. What is he, a political revolutionary? The man who would be messianic king? Is he a traveling healer? Is he an exorcist? Is he a teacher? What is he? Who is he? Well, some scholars have said he's like a moose with antlers, so he can wear a whole lot of different hats. Others have said no, he was one, if any, of these roles, but how could he be all of them? Well, if you compress them all together and said, oh, yeah, we're talking about the same Jesus, then Jesus is a body with many heads. What is the myth he's talking about from Eden? It's one in which Satan seduces the virgin fiancée of Adam. Well, that, of course, was the rabbinic legend about Satan using the snake to impregnate Eve, so that Cain was not Adam's son, but Satan's son. And it must be something like that. I wanted to avoid that. I wanted to present you to Christ, the new Adam, just as God wanted to deliver Eve as a pure virgin to his first man, Adam. But let's see. But you're easy marks for charlatans like this. Let me start again with verse 3. But now I fear that perhaps somehow, as the serpent seduced Eve by his deviousness, your minds may have been seduced from the simple purity of Christ. For indeed, if someone arrives and proclaims another Jesus whom we did not proclaim, or if you receive a different spirit that you did not receive from us, or a different gospel from the one you originally welcomed, a new message of salvation, a rival one, yet you have not the slightest trouble putting up with him. Some fraudulent preacher that has a rival gospel, you don't mind that, to your shame, right? 5, for I estimate that in no respect do I fall short of the super apostles, his detractors. Bob, why are you wasting your time with that guy? We've got visions, revelations, and miracles. We're plugged into the source. By the way, that is the super apostles in Greek. It's the Hyperleon apostoloi, literally the super apostles. They make such tall claims for themselves and denigrate me. They're Superman. I'm just Jimmy Olsen. Come on, don't fall for that, Paul says. Verse 6, but if in truth I am unskilled in speech, yet I am not so in gnosis, for we have instead manifested our gifts in every way to you. You know this. You remember the stuff you're so impressed with in these gospel gigolos. I had that and then some. I hate to say so, but you're forcing me to it. That boy, he's getting even more sarcastic as this goes on. Verse 7, or did my sin lie in humbling myself so that you could be exalted? Because I evangelized you with the gospel of God free of charge. No, I robbed the other congregations, accepting their wages so I could serve the brothers, so I could serve you. Uh, that's what they're saying, right? Oh, yeah, I guess that's so, huh? 9. When present with you and in need, I was a burden to no one, for the brothers arriving from Macedonia supplied my needs, and in every respect I kept from becoming a burden to you. And so I will remain. And 10. As the truth of Christ is in me, I swear no one will deprive me of this boast in the regions of Achaia, the Greek province in which Corinth was said. Um, for these are false apostles. Wait a minute, wait a minute. Okay, 12. But what I do, I will keep right on doing in order to prevent anyone boasting that they practice the same as us. For these are false apostles, charlatans, masquerading as apostles of Christ. And that should surprise no one, for the accuser himself masquerades as an angel of light. Thus, it is no great surprise if his servants too masquerade as servants of righteousness. Their ultimate fate will be as their deeds deserve. Well, that I think is going to be the end of today's chapter of Second Corinthians. We are going to finish the letter and then have some other comments, but let's see what comments you have and questions for me for today. I have a primitive caveman manipulating the different graphics. His name is Bob Price. Um, all righty. Okay, we got some good mornings and greetings and so on. Um, Stephen Smolak says the faith was a Christian interpretation. Uh, when this is from yesterday's mention of the changing connotation of faith in the epistles in the Corinthians and Romans and so on. It seems to refer to an existential commitment of faith, possibly against all evidence, like Abraham daring to believe God's promise that his centenarian wife would give him offspring. Well, since God's in play here, I can't doubt that it's possible. I'm going to believe it. I'm going to expect the birth of a son of mine. Well, hey, that was no mean feat, and God chalked it up as righteousness in Abraham's column. But in the pastoral epistles and in the book of Jude, for instance, the faith has become the creed of the Christian religion. The content one believes, not the taking the leap of faith. So that's around the 2nd century, at the beginning of it, I'd say. Uh-huh. Stephen Griffiths, hi, folks. A timely reminder from Pseudo History. You don't know what happens after death any more than you know what happened before your birth. You don't know how it ends any more than you know how it began. Right? Oh. Chris Marsh says, I think Dennis McDonald's correct. Jesus was given so many hats to seem greater than the other gods and heroes of his time. Jeff Ape 63. I seem to remember that the Torah names Pantera as Jesus' father, redacted by the church recovered from Babylonian Torah. Um, Actually, it's the Talmud, not the Torah itself, that brings up the Pandera story. And let's see. But some people, some Christians, I think Epiphanius of Salamis, took it seriously enough to add Pandera somewhere in the back of the genealogy of Jesus. And why, I don't know. Okay, well, that's the end of the questions, and we're ending up a little early today because I've got a bunch still to do, and I'm getting pretty sleepy. You probably are, long dozing by this time. I hope not, but at any rate, yeah. So I will see you tomorrow at um, 4 for the Gnostic Sabbath. Should be fun. I got some good stuff picked out to share with you then. Um, let's see here.